Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining this month's How to Hex. I'm Tabitha, and today we'll be talking about building interactive data apps in Hex. So I'll start by showing you a demo, and then we'll leave time at the end for questions. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A widget to ask your questions, and we'll get to them at the end. So we'll start by giving you just like a quick overview of what Hex is for maybe those of you that are not familiar. Then we'll talk about from the end user experience, all of the different types of interactivity elements that you have. And then we'll actually dive under the hood into a Hex notebook and show you how that's all accomplished. So we'll jump into Hex. And for those of you who are not familiar with what Hex is a unified platform for working with data that brings together data science, self-serve exploration, and data apps. It helps consolidate that fragmented landscape that a lot of data tools, working with a lot of data tools, empowers data teams to just work faster, and also is able to bring business stakeholders into that same place that your data team is actually doing their work. So the way that this works is that every Hex project has two sides to it. You have the notebook, which is a cell-based workflow with a variety of different cell types. You have your code cells, but also your charts and interactive elements such as input parameters. And then you have the app builder, where you can actually take all of those insights that you've put together in the notebook and actually share that out into a nice polished app where you can really focus on that story that you're trying to tell or the decision you're trying to enable before you go and share that out with your stakeholders. So in the notebook, you have a bunch of different cell types. You're already connected to your data warehouse. So here I'm connected to my Snowflake. You can connect multiple different data sources. And I start my analysis here in a SQL cell where I aggregate up my revenue by a bunch of different metrics. The cool thing about Hex is that this output is actually saved as a building block in Hex that I can continue to reference and chain downstream in my analysis. So I create this purchases object, and then I can reference that in another SQL query or in my Python code, even in tables and charts. So a lot of different inputs and cell types that I have at my disposal to create this really robust analysis. Scrolling down here, you can see the same purchases data frame is then fed into this interactive no-code chart. And you can combine all of these different cell types to create these really interactive apps that you then put together into the app builder. So now jumping into this published app, this is the same project that I was just in the notebook. I'll walk you through the different interactivity elements here from the end user's perspective. So I'm a business stakeholder and this app was built for me by my data team. I want to go ahead and use this to what is interesting to me. So this has like a bunch of canned metrics here, obviously, but maybe I'm only interested in the computers category. So here I can leverage Hex's built-in interactivity. Nothing additional was needed on like the back end to build this. I can just go and apply this filter, which then filters down my chart to only look at the computers category. I can then, if I want to like explore this further, so like here I can see now what just looking at computers. For those like second and third level follow-up questions, I want to go ahead and like interact with this. I want to look at this in a different way. I want to add some additional columns into this chart. Maybe I want to understand like what are the subcategories within computers. And in order to do that, I can click on this explore button, which will allow me to interact with this chart in my own way. So I don't need to go and request from the data team for them to go and add something in, but I have a built-in chart here that I can slice and dice in my own way. So I can, if I want to see the breakdown of different subcategories, I can go ahead and drag this. Oops, chat is in the way here. I can go and replace my categories and look at all of the different subcategories within computers. I can apply different filters here. I can add calculations. I can look at all of the underlying data if I want. So a lot of options here for me to interact with this, to view this in the way that I want to. Then the next type of interactive element that I'll show you here is how I can leverage input parameters. So if I want to look at a different region, this is a built-in element that my data team has added for me to filter different elements of my app. I can look at the South region, for example. That will then update this text, and that will also update this chart here as well. So anything that was built as a downstream cell of this input will then get filtered in my app. And then going beyond kind of like the typical slicing and dicing that you see in other BI tools, you have this ability to build these like really complex models underneath the hood. Since you have access to SQL, but also Python, you can build data science models that then your team can go ahead and interact with. So rather than having to guess like what are the parameters that they want to look at, you can include these interactive elements where I can go and adjust the forecast period. I can look at what categories I want to look at, and that will actually rerun the model underneath the hood so that I, again, don't need to like hard code anything in here. But in real time, that will produce a new that will run the model and give me the output that I am interested in seeing. So a couple of different things here that I showed you, a lot of different ways that you can incorporate these interactive elements. One is you have like that built-in interactivity. Two is that you have these input parameters. And three, you can apply those input parameters to like data science models or really complex visuals. Cool. Now what I'm going to do is dive in underneath the hood to show you in the notebook how this was put together and how you can add all of these interactive elements into your project. So like we spoke about here, you have your SQL cells, your Python code, your no-code cells, your visuals. But the fun part is actually in this input parameter section, where here's where you can like customize and add that interactive element. So you have a suite of input options that you can use. The more basic ones are kind of like your drop down, your multi-select, those will be string selectors, you have dates, numbers, but then you also have even more advanced things like CSV uploads or table inputs or just free-form text fields. So a lot of options that you can have incorporate into your apps so end users can apply those inputs and then you can use those as variables in your code. So for example, here we can include a input parameter. Let's just look at like a drop-down example. You can choose whether this should be static or dynamic. So you can just type in a comma-separated list of values, or alternatively, you can use a dynamic drop-down where you can select from the inputs that are available in your project. So I can use this enrich data. I could select the value that I want. So if I want a category selector, and now I have this drop-down list that my end users can use. You can see here that this creates a variable called input1. I can name this category filter. Oh, I have some things. And now I can just have this category input that is used as a variable in all of my different cell types. So for example, here in this, I have this region one that I've already created that is being used here. I have some Python code and I am filtering my regions in my code by this region dynamic input that I have here. So as I run this, that will then update, as I change that will update the code and give me the top categories within that region. I can also use these inputs as markdown text. So here I'm using that same region parameter, and I'm also using this this array that I created in Python as part of that markdown text as well. This is something that I find is really useful for using variables in Markdown is like if you're writing a report and adding a lot of text, sometimes you'll go and just like hard code those numbers of like the day that you're writing them, but you can parameterize almost like anything in your project. So you calculate a metric, you have a variable, and you're writing a summary of that. That can be parameterized so that every time that it runs, it will update to be what the new output is. And then here, I'm also using this parameter in my SQL code. So this syntax here is using Jinja syntax. We have a lot of docs on that. I'll make sure to send those out afterwards as well on kind of how that syntax works. But you can see here, this is just a simple example where I'm taking the region input and filtering my data by that region. I'm also filtering where my categories in that top categories array. So this is like kind of like a basic example of what you can do with Jinja and with inputs. Scrolling down here a little bit, you can see you can do like even more complicated things with Jinja. You can have like conditional statements. You can also choose like, for example, how you want your users to like group or aggregate the data. So if maybe some people want to understand like the breakdown of different categories, they can select a group by category. Other people want to see the breakdown of different regions. They can select the breakdown of different regions. And you can see here that chooses like how my data is grouped or aggregated. And here, what I'm doing is I am referencing this dynamic group by column as part of my query. So I am using this like SQL safe parameter that allows me to like force the literal parameterization of that. So I'm saying I don't want you to write the word region here, but rather I want you to use that column of region and dynamically update what is in that value. So there's a ton you could do here with Jinja. You can use like for loops and if else logic to create these like really dynamic elements. Another example that I will quickly show you before we open the floor to questions is this feature success dashboard. So this is an app that a product analytics use case. This is actually an app that we use internally. This is a demo version of that app, but this is something that we use for like our product managers to track their feature usage. This is typically a use case that is kind of challenging to build in a lot of BI tools because you're often looking at new features that get added. So you need to like go and add that to the dashboard before you can look at it. But what this app allows you to do is that it has all of these dynamic elements where an end user or product manager in this case can go in and select what events they want to look at, select the subscription tier, the user role, the date, all of these different dynamic elements that I kind of just showed you in the notebook to create a really like complex analysis and visuals. So you can see like the time week, you can see here like how this group by is created. So the same thing that I just showed you, but here is like, how do we want to group engagement? So are we looking at this by role or subscription tier or just generally no group by? So you can create a ton of interactivity here by using Jinja. Cool. Well, I see a couple of questions coming in the chat. Please keep adding those. I'm going to take a look here and start answering them. Are you able to apply filters to different sections of the page rather than one filter for the entire page? Yes, definitely. So the way that you can do this is that in your project, you can create just like one input that gets applied everywhere. But you can create multiple different inputs that you apply to various different cells. So like, for example, here, I will scroll up here, like I have this region, I'm applying that filter to this specific cell. I have this brand, I can apply that to a different cell. And because you're doing this like within the code of those cells, you can choose which ones you want it to apply to. Next question is, can the table generated by that dynamic group be referenced or used in a chart, and would the group by column automatically be changed in the chart? That is a really good question. The You can feed that output into a chart. The only thing that can't be dynamically changed is what the like header columns are of that. So like the y-axis and the x-axis. So as long as you just name that something generic, you can choose whatever that column is. So like you'll just want to like, instead of having that here in this example of this group by here, I'll make this a little less abstract and actually show you. So here, instead of calling this region or calling this category, you'll just want to call this like column name. So instead of this, like we could just call this like metric. And then you can do that in a chart. Otherwise, it won't know which column to pull from if it were to change. Um, cool. Next question is, how does version control work? Can versions be synced with Git externally? Great question. We have full version control managed in Hex. So clicking here, you can see all of the history and versions on your project. So you can see all of the changes that I made. And then you can see here that there is an integration with Git where you can sync your projects to a Git provider. This is just a one-way integration. So like the reason you would want to store something and use this Git integration is if you just want like to have a backup and store all of your code in Git. It's not going to be a push and pull environment. That will all be done directly in Hex, where you can see the version control here. You can also apply reviews. You can request reviews on publishing projects directly in Hex, so you don't need to use Git for that. Cool. The next question from Curtis, can you use Jinja in the label of single value comparisons? Use case would be if the comparison was positive, you would say the metric increased by X, if negative, decreased by X. So what I think you're referring to here is the single value cell. You can reference, and you can actually see here that in the title of this, you can use like dynamic parameterization. So you can reference a variable that you have. So if I want to like use the region to parameterize that, I can do that as well. In the comparison, you can also apply this label to use to update that. So yes, to answer the question, yes, you can. You can say the metric decreased or the metric increased based on the parameters that you define above or below. Cool. The next question here, what would be the best practice in improving the speed of the dashboard? For example, if we have a huge data set, for example, usage of the service. Yeah, great question here. There are a lot of different things that you can do to optimize your dashboards. I think that there have actually been some previous how to hexes on just like general optimization practices, and we can send links to those out. Maybe there's also some upcoming in the future about that. To give you the short answer of that, the best way and probably like quickest answer of like what you can do is what we call query mode. And I'll just scroll up to a SQL query here where if this is like a really massive data set that I'm pulling in, the default mode of any query that I run is going to be like in data frame mode, which means that it is actually like pulling this into the memory of my Hex project for me to then like reference downstream. Alternatively, for those like large queries that I have or the large data sets that I want to pull in, I can use query mode, which will allow me to just keep that query in the warehouse and reference like just reference the query rather than actually referencing the data. So every time I call that, it will just push down the compute to, in this case, run in Snowflake. But in whatever warehouse you're using, it would push down the compute there. Keep that to leverage that compute so that you don't need to pull it into Hex memory. So I would say that is like the quickest answer of like what is the quick and easy way to improve performance. That would probably be that. But again, there's like a lot of different ways, and we have some documentation on this, so we could be sure to send that out afterwards as well. Cool. Next question I see is, are users of the app view paid users? Great question. There are three types of users in Hex. you have your standard editor user who is editing in the project. Those are your developers, your data analysts, your data scientists. Then you have on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have your viewers. So viewers are the ones that are just viewing the app. So if I jump over to the app, they can like apply they could apply filters, they could interact with input parameters, but they're not doing anything beyond that. In between that, you have your explorer user, who are the type of users that are kind of your like data savvy technical users, but not quite your like analyst or data scientist. And those are the ones that would be like slicing and dicing even further to clicking on this explore button, and going beyond what is just like consuming apps that have built. Um, Cool. A couple of more questions here, scrolling through to see them. Do you have any examples of using the play button to separate chunks of an analysis within the same notebook? Yes, great question. I actually do have one pulled up here. So I think there should be one in here. Yes, okay. So the run button or the play button, whatever you want to call it, is another type of an input parameter. And essentially that creates a dynamic variable that is a true or false variable. So in this case, so like one common use case of using that is if you want a user to like apply all of the parameters or in all of the inputs before you actually run the query. So like in this case here, you want your user to select the airline, the departure airport, the departure dates before those filters get applied. So the way that you could do that is by including a run button, where you include this parameter. And then your query will look something like this of you have a conditional logic here, where you say if the airline is not none, so the airline is filled out, and the run button is set to true, which means that someone pressed that run button, then run the query. Otherwise, I will get this default message of please fill out the filters and click the apply button to query the data. So that's how you can separate out some of these if you want to make sure that like your end users are first applying all of these filters before the query gets run, and then you run it afterwards. Cool. Can input parameters be used in hex charts? For example, I have a hex chart displaying multiple regions as distinct lines. Can this be controlled using an input cell, or is filtering the chart the only option? So let me play this back. So you have a hex chart that you have multiple regions, and you want to choose like which regions are applied in the chart. I think a couple of ways that you can do this. I'll just jump back into a notebook example to show you. One is that in the chart, and this is actually something I should have called out, is that you can apply actually a filter. I don't want this data. I want it to be. Let me just get a chart here. You can apply a filter using an input directly. So if I want to use my region input that I created, I can also use that in a chart. So that will dynamically update the region based on the input that I used. The other option is that you can apply this in your SQL query above the chart and then have the chart just take in whatever you've filtered. So if I write a SQL query, you select star from enriched data where region equals region, then I can name this filtered df, and then I can use this filtered df as the input to my chart. So that's how I would use those inputs as part of your filters in your charts. Um, cool. A couple of more questions that we can get to in the last few minutes. I know you didn't show this, but do the magic AI features train on table data or just the table metadata? Great question. None of the data is being used to train any models. So we use OpenAI zero retention, zero training policy. So that we're never training on any of the data. And we can also send over some more information on that afterwards. What about guest users? Guest users can be any of the type of users. So guest users can be viewers or guest users can be explorers, and depending on which one you give them access to be, they can whatever access level they have on the project. So within the project, so a user is defined a role, and then on the project, they are also defined access. So here I have full access to this project, but I can go and add someone else into the project, and I can choose if I want to give them editor access, explorer access, or can view app. On the topic of guest users, I see there's another question. Is there a limit on the number of guest users? I don't think that there is, but I can double check that, and we'll be sure to follow up on that as well. Cool. I think this will probably be the last question that we'll get to live, but can you create your own templates following specific structure and pre-filled cells and share it to your team? Great question. You can. And what they are called in Hex is components. So the way that you can do that, or what a component is pretty much just a grouping of cell types that can be shared across different projects. So I can take a bunch of different cells that I've created. Maybe I want to take this chart and this pivot table and this table, and I can then go and actually save that as a new component. I can name this component what I want. I could publish this component. I can choose who has access to it. And then other users can actually go and add this component into their project. So I can now click on add component, and now I can reference any components that exist within my library to add it to my project. So these are how you can use kind of like predefined templates to actually share across the team. Cool. I know there are a couple more questions still in the chat. We will take a look at these and follow up with some resources to help answer these questions. But thanks so much for joining today. I hope this was helpful. Just to give you guys like a quick summary of what we covered. We spoke through all of the different interactive elements in your published apps. So the built-in interactivity that you have, from filters to explorations, but then also how you can add dynamic input parameters. And then we dove in under the hood to look at, within the notebook, how you actually apply the input parameters using Jinja to create these really robust and dynamic apps. Cool. We have a couple of other events coming up in the next few weeks and months. I will actually be at the Gartner conference next week. If any of you will be there, would love to see you there as well. And then we have some other How to Hexes coming up, and other both in-person and virtual events that we'll be sure to send out. So thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.